Okay, we are going to begin our conversation continuing prophets, and we've finished the pre-exilic prophets, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and at least the first part of Isaiah. Of course, Isaiah, as we learned last time, extends far beyond just the pre-exilic group. And we talked about our Federal Express delivery truck analogy that helps us to understand the boxes that were packaged up by the prophets and sent ahead to future audiences. So our first exilic prophet is Micah, who reigned during the Judah kings Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, just after the fall of Samaria. And in many ways, like this picture, he was like a mini-me version of Isaiah, only his audience was Judah and Jerusalem in the south. So like the book of Isaiah that we talked about with regards to authorship and the three Isaiahs, critical scholar position, scholars have done a similar thing with Micah. And they've looked at the emphasis of the book and suggested that just the first 3 chapters would have come from the prophet, and chapters 4 through 7 would have come from a author operating at a later time during the post-exilic period. This idea and this early thinking came from the German scholar Heinrich Ewald, operating during the mid-1800s. So I was interrupted, sorry. The conservative approach to this is the Federal Express idea, well, with Micah being an active prophet right after the Assyrian expansion and the fall of Israel and Samaria. And like he would have been just on the heels, the coattails of Amos and Hosea and Jonah. Now he's focusing on Judah in the south in terms of his delivery. So if we take the role of prophet seriously, we can understand how Micah would be able to package things up and deliver them to future audiences. So while he's talking to Judah and Jerusalem before the exile, he just as well can package something up for delivery for that post-exilic audience, and that's what we see with the emphasis in the book. According to the superscription of the book, the first verse, similar to Amos, Micah grew up in a small town, Moreshah, and like Amos, he addresses the wealthy class of Judah, and like Amos, attacks and addresses the injustice and the oppression that he sees in his context. For example, chapter 2 in Micah, verses 1 through 2. Woe who those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When morning comes they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They rob a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. Therefore thus says the Lord, I am planning against this family a calamity, from which you cannot remove from your necks. So you see the judgment is directly against this attitude that's apparently as prevalent in Judah in the south as it was for Israel in the north. Micah is also going to have some opposition from false prophets in his day. And in chapter 3, beginning in verse 5, "Thus says Yahweh concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, when they have something to when they have something to bite with their teeth, they cry peace. But against him who puts nothing in their mouths, they declare holy war. Therefore will it not be night for you without vision?" He asked the prophets, and these false prophets were giving a false message of a false sense of security, you might say, for Micah's audience in Jerusalem and in Judah. They perhaps were going back to places like the everlasting covenant, the Davidic covenant, and they were thinking in their own minds, look, we're untouchable. God's not going to do anything to us because he's made all of these wonderful everlasting promises going all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant, and now look how much he's blessing us, and look how good we are, and these bad things can't happen, Micah. You're the false prophet here. So will the real prophet stand up? So you can understand how much of a difficult sell this was for Micah the prophet. As a result, Micah is going to have a well-crafted strategy with regards to corrective theology. He is going to develop the prophetic concern. Not that we've not seen it before, but primarily he'll bring more emphasis on the remnant. In chapter 2, for example, verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with men. The beaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through at the gate, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord is at their head. Yahweh is at their head. So, it's this idea that God himself will be king over who? Well, it's always been about the righteous remnant. And we've got a reference over the fact of who's going to be king over them. Micah goes back to the Davidic covenant, but he'll be king over the remnant. Chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. As for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you, capital O1, will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are like from long ago, from days of eternity. This is one more verse, I think. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren, that is the remnant, will return to the sons of Israel. Who's the Messiah going to ultimately rule over? Well, on one hand, it's the whole world, over the entire cosmos. But that special covenant relationship will be established and continued, extended to, on the basis of the remnant. So the corrective theology for Micah, as well as so many of the other prophets that we'll see, Judah would have had a response to Micah. Well, what about that scepter that will never depart from Judah? Right? Micah, what are you talking about? The covenant with David's covenant. Wasn't that unconditional and eternal? Question mark? Wasn't David promised a perpetual seed and dynasty? Micah, what are you talking about? Jerusalem's going to fall. We've got these ongoing unconditional promises from David and from the Abrahamic covenant. But what we see, though, is the corrective theology that Micah is going to say the promises, these unwavering, unconditional, forever, everlasting promises, have always been about the righteous remnant, not the majority of unfaithful. They're not willy-nilly under some umbrella protection clause and some kind of overarching global life insurance policy. It's always been for the righteous remnant. In fact, we see this balance of in the prophetic message here in the diagram. You've got hope and judgment, and there's tension between those two, right? It's like a polarization. You're going to aggravate some kind of let's say some kind of chemistry experiment. This is going to create kind of a separating kind of environment. The balance between hope and judgment. Who goes through between and emerges from this kind of chemistry of hope and judgment is the righteous remnant. They're going to be the ones who emerge from or come forth from the nation as a whole within Israel. So, I used this example this morning. Micah would be invited to First Baptist Church, Jerusalem. He preaches his sermon of judgment, which is directed at the entire congregation. But then he's invited to a Sunday school class down the hall on the right. And on that door, Sunday school classes have names, right? On that door is called the righteous remnant or the remnant. And then what Mike he goes in there and he gives a select message of hope to the remnant. Because they're the ones asking the question, well, what does God have for us? Has he given up on us? The answer is always no. He's not given up on the righteous remnant. So this helps us understand that, the majority, the ones who have the false hope in Micah's audience, are the ones asking the question, and they're the ones given the false hope by the false prophets. Yeah, everything's going to be okay because God's promised, and he's made this everlasting promise to King David. But see, Micah says, no, there's something that I have to correct. Those promises were always meant for the remnant who would emerge from the testing and the refining exilic experience that is just around the corner for Judah. So in the classroom with the nameplate on the door that says remnant, here's the pinnacle moment for Micah's message of hope and encouragement in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. I love this passage. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it, and many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh and to the house of God, the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the Torah, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He'll judge between many peoples. He'll render decisions for the mighty and the distant nations. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war." You've got this incredibly theologically packed discussion about Zion and this coming idea, which focuses on the future king who will sit on his throne and rule, and as an extension of his rule, nations will come forth and will, be under the rulership. So this invitation, you see it in verse 2, "Come, let us go up." I'm doing some work right now in my own research on the last word of the book of Chronicles is the invitation. Let him go up. And I think it's an open-ended question or an open-ended invitation that lines up with this Zion theology. In other words, who is invited to go up to this mountain? What's up there? Well, it's where God will sit on a throne and rule as king. That's where the Messiah, the Lord himself, will come and rule. And you see that the reversal will happen. No more war. Soldiers will be turning their weapons of war into weapons of harvest, and there'll be peace. And you see the fulfillment of some of the long-standing promises that God had made. For example, the Abrahamic covenant. When will it be true that the nations will be blessed as an extension of God's blessing to his own people? When will that happen in its fullness? What's going to happen at Zion? The nations are streaming, literally the water is flowing up to the top of the mountain. And this is really the consummation of all of the covenants and the promises, kind of as a continuous thread from the very beginning all the way up through Christ himself, and even then some. So we've got this idea of Zion showing up in this passage. Okay, we're going to continue on now with Jeremiah, and we're going to have just as Micah. The prophet Micah was the mini-me I told you about of Isaiah. So it's good to think about Jeremiah and his mini-me, which is Zephaniah. He's the mini-me version of Jeremiah. But we'll talk about Jeremiah first, and then move to Lamentations, and then finish up with Zephaniah. Both of the prophets were contemporaries. That is, Jeremiah and, as we'll see with Zephaniah, were contemporaries with King Josiah. They were prophetically active during the politically led reforms of King Josiah. Jeremiah here holds the record for the longest active prophetic career, over 40 years, as well as the longest book, 66 chapters. He'll be an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem, the events leading up to and during the fall of Jerusalem. He'll hand his prophetic baton to the prophet Ezekiel, who goes with the exiles to Babylon. But then he'll continue his prophetic message and ministry to the remainder of exiles who are left over in Jerusalem, who eventually take him down to Egypt. That's where Jeremiah ends up, and we don't hear from him again, although I have a theory about that. Here in just a little bit I'll talk to you about it. The waistband ideas this deep thought picture portrays comes out of Jeremiah 13, 1 through 11. I'll give you a little chance to read that. Just hit pause on your play feature here. Read that text, and it's an interesting case study, because Jeremiah is probably the one prophet who does most with parables And these serve as prophetic, literally word pictures or sermon illustrations, you might say. So here he is holding up a waistband, which is better than loincloth or whatever translation you might have, but it's really, the bling of the ancient world. You wear it around your waist and it would define you, kind of your status. It's an ancient Near Eastern bling. And here he is holding it up. This is not before. So according to the passage that you read, you learned that Jeremiah holds the waistband up in his first sermon in First Baptist Church of Jerusalem, talks about this waistband as representing the spiritual pride of Jerusalem. It's something to be proud of. It's something to boast about. Just like, look around. And here he is giving this sermon and encouraging the unfaithful majority in the pews, and he's saying, this represents us. Look how good we are. And then he leaves town, and then he goes up to the Tigris-Euphrates River valley, and he plants this waistband under a rock in the river. Of course, this is where Babylon is. He goes on a little excursion, leaves it there for a few weeks, comes back, goes back up and gets it, and then brings it back. And now he's ready for sermon number 2. Now he's holding it up in front of the congregation, and he's pointing at it, and he's saying, this is you, Jerusalem. Your pride will be ruined when you go into exile, right? And that's exactly what is around the corner for Jerusalem. It's their pride that's going to be ruined, just like this waistband. So you see, if you read things like this in the prophetic message, you have to understand something like this has probably got a actual object lesson behind it in terms of what he would have done. He would have worn that ruined waistband around his waist, and as he's going around for, walking around downtown Jerusalem, he's showing it off, and he's using it as a continual billboard for his prophetic message of what God's going to do against your spiritual pride, O Jerusalem. Jeremiah is one of the more painted prophets. Here's the Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Jeremiah is going to be a contemporary, some of the more difficult days in the history of Israel. He's going to literally carry these emotions on his back as a prophet. So he's a contemporary to King Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And, after Josiah, things got really, really bad really, really quickly. And here the prophet is caught in the crossfire. So between 722 and 587 or 86, and even then a little bit after that, 4 years after that, he's a prophet and he's active. Just like Moses led Israel out of Egypt to the promised land, Jeremiah experiences a reverse. So he leaves the promised land to go back to Egypt, only against his will. Now there's a critical scholarly conversation about the text of Jeremiah. So this is a textual critical kind of discussion that I'm going to have with you. The problem is that the Masoretic text, the standardized text that we have with our Hebrew Bibles, right? And if you get into Hebrew, that's what you'll use, the MT, we call it. If we compare that to an older version, in this case, we compare it to the Greek translation of the Hebrew text dating back to 250 BC, then that's the Septuagint. We have differences. Houston, we have a problem. It's not really that big of a problem, but it is something we have to acknowledge. So the Masoretic text has about 2,700 more words in it than the shorter version or the Septuagint. Now, to address this, a lot of the kinds of things that we see could be put in the bucket called just translation issues. In other words, you're going from Hebrew to Greek. So standard phrases like "thus says the Lord" could be kind of consolidated in a translation "says the Lord." So you're missing a word there. You're adding a word in the MT and subtracting a word in the LXX. Another phrase, for example, "the Lord, comma, the God of Israel," in the MT could be simplified, and oftentimes is in the Greek translation, with just Lord. Or in Greek, it's Kyrios. Also, so how we respond to this is that the textual critical rule of thumb is this: the shorter reading is the most preferred. And this is because over time you see scribes have a tendency at times to embellish or add more words as they're copying or translating in the case of the LXX. So the shorter version in this case, in other words, the Septuagint, may reflect an older and more accurate to the original version of the book of Jeremiah. Another difference between the MT and the Septuagint has to do with the chapters 46 through 51. In the Septuagint, these chapters are put earlier in the arrangement of the chapters. Right after chapter 25, verse 31, is where you find these oracles against the nations, which in the MT is really at the end of the book. Now, the MT also has a different arrangement of these nations. So generally going in from west to east, you go from Egypt and you end up with Babylon. Now in the Septuagint moves Babylon right in the middle, probably for emphasis. Now one interesting theory, it's hard to know for sure, this is exactly what happened in our reconstruction. But if you've got Jeremiah active in it as a prophet in Jerusalem, and he's going to be writing these things down through his scribe Baruch, he'll have a version of the book of Jeremiah, and he'll leave it with those who go into Babylon for the 7 years in exile. Now remember what happens to him physically. He leaves the promised land to go to Egypt, and he's probably either got an edition of the book of Jeremiah from himself, right, that he wrote through his scribe Baruch. He goes to Egypt. Now what if I told you that Egypt is also the historic location of the activity behind the translation into Greek of the Old Testament? The Hebrew into Greek happened in Egypt. So the birthplace of the Septuagint or the LXX is Egypt. What if the Septuagint translators had access to one of the, you might say, second edition books of Jeremiah from the very hand of the prophet? What if Jeremiah had a chance to go down to Egypt, and taking his edition, he himself slightly updated it? Maybe he's the one responsible for changing up the arrangement of the oracles against the nations. Why? He's bringing more emphasis to Babylon. He's the one that did that for theological reasons. Now that's just, a theory out there, but it may be one way of understanding the different editions. So once these, you have islands of copying that go on from that point on, and all the scribes behind the original were pretty meticulous in copying, counting letters and all of that, but that could account for the addition of the words, as well as the rearrangement of the oracles against the nations. So you can take that and talk to your wife about it at home tonight. Maybe not. Alright, let's move on. And here's Rembrandt's version of the weighed down and dealing with the reality of life prophet named Jeremiah. German scholars, and always leave it to those German scholars, and they always look mean in their pictures, but the more the liberal idea for with regards to authorship of Jeremiah, similarly to some of the other larger prophets, you're going to have scholars who come along and want to argue for multiple authorships of a single book. All started with the study of the Pentateuch, and you've got 4 Moseses writing one book. But what these scholars did, beginning with Bernard Doom in the early 1900s, is argued that only the poetic sections, basically you've got 2 genres of writing in the prophetic book Jeremiah: poetry and prose or narrative. So Doom is the one who said, well, that the original to the prophet Jeremiah is just the poetry, and the narrative is coming from some other author, probably a disciple of Jeremiah or somebody like that, who's adding the historical narrative in and around or intertwining Jeremiah's prophecy and his short sermons and messages. Sigmund Mowinckel in 1914, just about 14 years later, called for three sources for the book of Jeremiah. Source A would be Jeremiah 1, the authentic 1 through chapters 1 through 25, largely due to Jeremiah because it's all poetry. Then you've got a B source, Jeremiah B, representing chapters 26 through 45, and that's the biographic narrative portion. And you've got Jeremiah C, so this third source, and this represents kind of a Deuteronomic overlay or redaction of chapters 1 through 25. Now this Deuteronomic emphasis comes from that 7th century time and put emphasis into the text, such as emphasis on the temple, the covenant, monotheism, divine retribution, and obedience to the Torah. And more recently, scholars such as John Bright have argued against the multiple authorship viewpoint and has kind of landed scholarship maybe a little bit more towards just the unity of the book for one author. And again, we have to recognize some of these German scholars will dismiss the active role of a prophet, and they certainly wouldn't like the Federal Express delivery truck analogy one bit. But we have to say and recognize, look, these prophets, not only did they know their Old Testament, so that shouldn't surprise us that Jeremiah is quoting from Moses so often in his covenantal judgment against the nation Judah and Jerusalem. He knows his Old Testament. He's pulling from the Bible of his day in bringing his case against the guilty. And another thing, he's hearing from the Lord, right? So you've got the combination of word and revelation. Jeremiah has this full wall of message that's coming out of him as a bubbling forth prophet. He's got to speak. So that's the kind of thing that we recognize, and he's packaging some things up for future audiences. So the first major section is chapters 1 through 25, which is really the primary center of gravity for the message of judgment against Jerusalem. So like Hosea, Judah's idolatry will be compared to the sins of a prostitute. So I've given you some examples of text, chapters 2, 4 through 3, 5, and then chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, and then verses 19 through 23. Jeremiah is going to announce the disaster that will be coming from the north in chapter 4, verse 6, namely the Babylonians. And Jeremiah will also reflect God's concern for the nations. Chapter 9, verses 25 through 26. I'll let you look at that. Let's look at this together. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. So I'll just read the first part of Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 1. So here he is receiving opposition from the opposing false prophets. Or here, in this case, it's the false priests, the pastors of the day. When Pashur, the priest, the son of Immer, who was chief officer in the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things, Pashur had Jeremiah, the prophet, beaten, and then put him in the stocks that were in the upper Benjamin gate, which is by the house of the Lord. So what did Jeremiah do in response? Verse 4, he doesn't shut up. For thus says the Lord, behold, I am going to make you a terror to yourself and to your friends, and while your eyes look on, they will fall by the sword and their enemies, and so I shall give over all Judah to the hand of the king of Babylon. So he has no way to be silenced, even being put in the stockades. You can't. The only way to stifle a prophet who's bubbling forth is to basically have his head chopped off. So he stood his ground against these false prophets. And in chapter 25, verse 11 through 12, he's going to predict the 70 years that's just around the corner for Jerusalem. These nations will serve the king of Babylon in verse 11, 70 years. Then it will be, when 70 years are completed, I'll punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. So the Babylonians will be a puppet of the Lord under his sovereignty. They'll be allowed to exile Jerusalem, and this is going to happen And 70 years after that, they'll be allowed to return under a new servant of the Lord, namely, as we saw last week, King Cyrus. So after the judgment chapters, we've got chapters 26 through 45. That'll be the biographical narratives that'll focus in on Jerusalem. And what's shocking about Jeremiah's message is that his part of his message was to Jerusalem, basically saying, look, they're the Babylonians, they're coming. When they get here and knock on your door, let them in and become their vassal. That's God's plan A for your life. And we see that in Jeremiah 27, 6 through 8. Probably the high point, though, of the book. And again, this is the special message that he had reserved in a special box to be packaged up and delivered to the exiles who were in Babylon during that 70-year period. So amidst the chaos, Jeremiah the prophet is going to speak to the remnant. And he, like Martin Luther, is going to nail up his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door. And this is called the Book of Consolation. And this is going to primarily, this is going to be chapters 31 through 33. And again, the prophet, like what we saw before with Micah, he's going to address the question of what the remnant should do in response to this chaos in the world that's being turned upside down. One of the big ideas that he's going to come back and keep repeating through these 3 chapters is the fact of God restoring or bringing restoration for his people. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 8. And it shall come about on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off their neck, which is the captivity or the exile, and will tear off their bonds, and strangers shall no longer make them their slaves. But they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, who I will raise up for them. So there's the theology of the Messiah. And fear not, O Jacob, my servant, declares the Lord. I was reading verse 10, but let's move up to verse 3 in that same chapter. This is the idea of the restoration. So, for behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah. The Lord says, I'll bring them back to the land that I gave their forefathers, and they shall possess it. So there's this return to the land. There's this restoration and reuniting. You're going to see this emphasis in verse 8 in chapter 30, chapter 31, verse 23, chapter 32, verse 44, and chapter 33, verse 7 and 11. And it's going to happen because the Lord, he's the one that's going to pull it off. Chapter 32, verse 17. The prophet says, Ah, Yahweh God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth, and by your great power and by your outstretched arm, nothing is too difficult for you. So again, this is all based on the fact of God and who he is in and of himself and his ability to come through with his end of the deal, the covenant arrangement. And then you've got the new covenant. God, this covenant idea in Jeremiah, you can call it a new covenant, but it's really a continuation of so much of what we've already seen in the ongoing covenant promise. The faithful remnant, chapter 31, verses 31 through 37. Again, they're always announced, behold, days are coming. What's going to happen on that day when this king, this David-like king comes? Well, on that day, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, new or renewed, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my Torah within them, on their heart, and I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So this idea of an internalized Torah, writing God's instructions, his instructions manual for life, will be kind of an internalization. There'll be the work of God himself through his, according to Ezekiel, the capital S Spirit will be an active part of this heart transformation. So this renewal will extend not just to bringing the nation back together, but this renewal, this restoration will also include the reviving of the heart of the people, of the people of the Lord. The remnant will be energized for this purpose of expressing obedience before the Lord. And you see there in the closing verses of this chapter 31, beginning in verse 35, all of this is grounded in the surety of the fact that the universe is pretty predictable. You know, you look up the fixed orbit of the moon, the stars for light by night. Who is it that's overseeing this whole thing? Well, it's the same one that's overseeing the fulfillment of the covenant. Look up at the night sky and be reminded of that. If this fixed order departs from me, declares Yahweh, then the offspring of Israel also shall cease. He's throwing the gauntlet down. He's saying, look, don't be discouraged. I've got your back, God says. You know, nothing is out of kilter according to my plan. Jeremiah was right. Going to Babylon was plan A. But through that, and you see it in the chart here, what's going to happen in exile? You've got hope and you've got judgment. And you've got no neutrality in that scenario. And between hope and between judgment always produces and emerges a righteous remnant. There's got to be some kind of metallurgical idea behind this. It's kind of like what I've talked about before with refining gold, and sometimes in modern refining you can do a chemical, you can add certain chemicals that agitate and stir up and make the chemistry work, right? So that there's this purification that takes place. Maybe it's done with electricity, depending on what kind of metal you're trying to get all the impurities out of. I think it's kind of like that. There's this spiritual refining that takes place, and it involves a little bit of electrolysis, a little bit of electricity, a little bit of chemistry, and it's all mixed together and agitated, and through that kind of is a refined remnant that is produced. And this is what God, this is what happens in a fallen world until the king comes back to rule. And that's going to happen at Zion. So we've got a remainder of this section, chapters 34 through 39. 5 chapters there that are largely focusing biographically on Jehoiakim and Zedekiah just before the fall of Jerusalem. Then we've got chapters 40 through 45 that are going to focus on events just after the fall. This gets into Jeremiah. He's encouraging them to turn themselves in. He's there in Jerusalem with that last little vestige of the poorest to the poor. And then finally in chapters 46 through 51, this is the oracles of nations that 10 nations are listed. Jeremiah shares the concern that God has for the nations and justice and all of those themes. And then finally one last chapter, 52, that functions like kind of a mini summary or postscript. It's going to recount the fall of Jerusalem, the capture of Zedekiah, the destruction of the temple, and then a recounting of the 3 Babylonian deportations when the exiles were taken out in 3 groups. Alright, I think we're ready for the next book. I kind of came up with the idea this morning, Lamentations. Jeremiah is linked to one who wrote Lamentations, and actually of all places in the book of 2 Chronicles 35:25. But the book of Lamentations is 5 chapters that captures the essence of, or the feeling, the pathos from the people, the idea that God has forsaken them, or not. I mean, it kind of presents that idea, but then it also addresses that idea in the same book. So it's interesting. It's a book, and I kind of thought of this, you know, for those of you who are in counseling ministries or you're involved in any kind of grief counseling, the combination of the fact of Lamentations, it's almost Jeremiah's special counseling book for a grieving nation. And he's written this book intended for the exiles who have gone into Babylon. They're the ones who are grieving the loss of their land and the loss of their temple and the destruction of their city. They're the ones that need this assistance and this help. So he's writing this book as a means of accelerating the grief and the mourning over the loss, right? But he's also doesn't leave them without hope, and we'll see that in the book here in just a minute. But you see, for example, here in chapter 2, I mean, there's nothing left there's nothing left hidden with regards to the real feelings that are kind of being aggravated here. It's almost like he's encouraging the grief and the mourning to kind of become more accelerated or more intense, which is an interesting counseling strategy, is it not? I think it's grieving as a natural process. So many times we want to comfort and almost cause the grieving to stop, with people who are hurting. But actually, it seems like the biblical example is that you need to be open and honest before God if you're in a situation of grieving over loss, whether it's somebody who's died, or in the case of Israel, Jerusalem, the fact of those who have lost their city and who have lost their identity as a nation. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. Sometimes it feels like that, doesn't it? It's just this dark cloud. It won't go away. That's loss. That's grieving, is it not? He has cast from heaven to earth the glory of Israel, and has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Sometimes it feels like you've been abandoned, right? Verse 2, the Lord has swallowed up, he has not spared, all the inhabitants of Jacob. In his wrath he has thrown down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought them down to the ground. He has profaned the kingdom and its princes. In fierce anger he has cut off all the strength of Israel. So, interesting study, those of you who, this would be a good case study. Jeremiah does a really interesting thing with this book and bringing people to this point of understanding, dealing with the emotions, right? But then we'll get to it here in just a little bit, not leaving them without hope. And there's almost a personal dimension to this book where Jeremiah breaks out into first person here in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction because of the rod of his wrath. He has driven me and made me walk in darkness and not light. Surely against me he has turned his hand repeatedly all the day. He has caused my flesh and my skin to waste away and has broken my bones. He has besieged and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship and dark places. He has made me dwell. Now, interesting connection. I remember the passage that we just got done seeing in the narrative part of the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah was thrown in a cistern for preaching the word. Maybe some of you out there serving in ministry are can identify with this idea, and maybe you can read something like this in this passage and kind of identify and be encouraged, because Jeremiah was one who, while he was passionate about preaching the truth of the and the message that the Lord had given him, he was opposed. He was put in the stockades. He was beaten, thrown at the bottom of a cistern, and he was ridiculed and threatened. And he had a hard message to a hard-hearted audience. And he saw the disintegration of his congregation, in Jerusalem. He saw and yet here he is in first person referring back to and identifying with the ones who are grieving. He's basically saying to them, he's writing this to the exiles, but he's saying, I was there. Jeremiah says, I witnessed the whole thing. Not only that, God kept giving me the messages to deliver. He was giving me how he felt, right? God, the divine vantage point. Talk about a burden to carry. So there's some deep thinking that we need to do about this, because if we're called to minister, we've got this burden too. And we were called to a flock, we're called to a congregation, we're called to a mission field, right? And we run into people who are opposing and hard-hearted, and we keep preaching and we get mud thrown on our face. But that's Jeremiah. And in the midst of this lament, he's personally lamenting, he breaks out into song. Chapter 3, verse 19. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood, which is really bitter, and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers, and this bowed down within me. This I recall to mind. So when he's literally with his face and his nose in the dirt, his posture is bowed down within him. What does he remember? Verse 21b, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And there's where the hymn comes from. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. Now there's a sermon waiting to happen there. But that's in the depths of despair. What comes forth? It's that idea. What comes forth through through the fire. It's that refining idea all over again. It's this remnant. What happens through that? Well, it's my knowledge of the Lord that deepens. It's my faith that's refined. It's my ability to trust in the Lord that's focused. All of these are good things and of great weight and value to the Lord. Yeah, it's painful. Yeah, we get mud thrown in our face, but it's what we're called to endure. So you get to the very end of the book of Lamentations in chapter 5, you see a prayer, and that's the last part of it. A prayer for mercy, a prayer to request. It's really a request. Lord, have mercy on our situation, in so many words. It's a prayer that Jeremiah writes for those exiles to say, this is what you need to do, is keep asking the Lord. I've talked to you already about the 70 years, but you need to keep trusting in the Lord that He's going to follow through. He's going to provide a servant who will issue a decree, namely Cyrus, and allow you all to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild and replant and reestablish your spiritual lives. So we have a mini-me version now of Jeremiah and the prophet Zephaniah. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the text of the first chapter here and start reading in chapter 1, verse 1. The word of Yahweh which came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. Now, the word of Yahweh which came to Zephaniah. So you've got, this is a prophet in action. The word of the Lord coming to the prophet. That goes back to Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 17. Now, his great-grandfather here is Hezekiah, one of the last great reforming kings in Jerusalem, leading up to Josiah. Now, if you remember from the survey course, we talk about the book of Torah, which was found or discovered in 622 BC, during some kind of temple renovation project. But before that, probably about 8 years before, Josiah had already begun his reforming efforts. So with the discovery of the book of the law, Zephaniah comes on the scene as an active prophet. So now you've got all cylinders firing with regards to this reform effort. And like this great courtroom scene, you've got Zephaniah showing up as a courtroom lawyer who's representing Yahweh and the king, King Josiah, against the guilty, which is the people. And this is God versus people in the courtroom drama that we've got going on. Or like this guy in the video, I'll just let you watch that for fun. Now, just as a way of summary, this kind of gives you an idea of how well grounded these prophets were in understanding and knowing the Bible of their day. They had access to the Bible. Perhaps this was part of the book of the law that was discovered in the temple wall during that renovation project. So you've got these Zephaniah passages pulling from the exact words or phrases or ideas from these portions of Deuteronomy. So as a lawyer, a covenant lawyer, Zephaniah is using God's word against God's people and Moses' teaching. So you've got Zephaniah the prophet. He's providing the prophetic reform energy. King Josiah is putting the clampers down with regards to the political side of reform. Remember, King Josiah is going to be the one tearing down the Asherah poles, the temples to Baal. But the real reformation's got to take place in the human heart. And that's where the prophetic message comes in. Alright, so he's offering, obviously, the theology behind the reform. And you can watch a live bulldozer in action running over a car. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 23, beginning in verse 4, you see the reason why King Josiah literally had to get out a bulldozer to clean house with regards to the idolatry, beginning in verse 4, vessels for Baal, for Asherah. All of these were piled up in a big heap and burned. They were worshiping the sun, the moon, the constellations, the whole host of heaven. So there's this idolatry. All of these things were cleaned house. And then verse 7, the reference to the male cult prostitutes. in the houses of Baal. Women were hanging ornaments for Asherah, and all the pagan priests were brought together and taken out and taken care of. Also, in verse 10, of all things, we've got in the valley of the son of Hinnom, no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire of Molech. So there's child sacrifice going on in the temples to Molech. So this is why the bulldozer needed to come out, and this is why Zephaniah as a prophet was very active and in a sense accelerating Josiah's politically driven reforms. And you've got some strong language back in Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 here. I shall wipe out completely everything on the face of the earth. The Hebrew word eretz could be translated land there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Declares Yahweh, I shall wipe out man and beast. I shall wipe out birds of the sky, fish of the sea, stumbling blocks of the wicked. Particularly, aka I shall wipe out man. I shall wipe him out from the face of the earth or land, declares Yahweh. Now, we're talking about global destruction here, or what's really going on. You know, one of the things that I always emphasize in my teaching, especially, for example, when you see some parallel language going on here that's drawn from the Genesis account of the flood, and the similar language blotting out idea in Genesis 6:7. Let's look back there. And in Genesis 6:7, you see a similar kind of idea. The Lord says, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I've made them. Now, one way of thinking about this, of course, there's judgment behind this, and there's a target that's in the intended area, ground zero of God's judgment. You know, God's judgment is always defined. It's just not thrown out willy-nilly. There's always a target of guilty who are being the recipients of God's judgment. But in the case that we've read, the text that we just read in verses 2 through 3, you've kind of got some strong language there. Of course, that's part of good preaching, is to get the attention of your people. But there's a reference Zephaniah uses to, in a sense, reverse the order of creation. So in order of removing or blotting out, you've got man, beast, birds, fish, and then the re-emphasis on the removal of man or humanity. Verse 3, you've got this idea of stumbling blocks. The Hebrew word there probably refers to pagan idols, molded after natural things or things found in nature. So they're worshiping animals, birds, fish, and other animals. And those are the items that need to be removed. So you see the theological basis for Josiah's reforms are the removal, according to Zephaniah's words in charge here in verses 2 through 3. This is about the removal of all images of idolatry that are showing up in the land. So not too far different from what Israel was called to do before they got to the promised land, right? God had some pretty strong words against idolatry, which was well entrenched and well grounded and also well funded. In the promised land, that all had to be driven out because that was the threat against the spiritual vitality and health of God's people. But now God has to turn that same judgment against his own people, who are now up to the old pagan tricks of the unconquered nations around. So Jesus is going to allude to this Zephaniah passage in Matthew chapter 13, verse 41. And just as Zephaniah links the wicked in the stumbling blocks, Jesus is going to also refer to the wiping out of those same things in the last days. So in the idea of his second coming. It may be that Zephaniah has that same final day of the Lord in mind with regards to this particular prophetic sermon here, that judgment that takes place on the final day of the Lord. This would be the equivalent to the final day of the Lord that the book of Revelation talks about with that global judgment. So it's, I think it's safe to say that you can kind of a both and, focusing on the idolatry of the immediate location in Jerusalem, because that's the ground zero for that particular judgment in this case. But then there's kind of a hint in this passage that kind of spreads out globally, right? So it could be a both and. God certainly is going to ultimately in that day, that final day that still hasn't yet come for us, deal with and judge all forms of idolatry and rebellion, hidden agendas, all those things that are against him. And like a good 115-degree day in West Texas, that day will be a hot day for the guilty and for the majority of unfaithful. For the faithful, it'll be a day of waiting for patiently, with faith, and with the understanding of and with the reason to have hope amidst the difficulty of the idea of judgment. So you've got that hope judgment thing, kind of the balance of the two. And that glorious day, that future day of the Lord, will be a day of waiting for the remnant. That's what we have to look forward to. So I'm kind of we talked about it earlier today in my Monday lecture, all 10 of us. We were talking about kind of like my approach. I think I err on the side of, it's an interesting new thing with regards to covenant theology as opposed to like dispensational theology. Instead of a two program, two kind of people idea, I kind of I think I see a real clear trajectory from the old to the new with regards to one program for one people, because the focus is always on the remnant. We've got this going all the way back to the original covenants, even through the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai. You've got the unconditional and the conditional kind of wrapped into one idea, and that always extends into the future. So what Christ does and accomplishes and what he's yet to do with his second coming all has to do and with the focus on the remnant. So we're grafted in to that righteous, we're grafted into that faithful remnant, and soon the focus will be back on, I would argue, Israel. But within Israel, it's not just national Israel, but it's the remnant within Israel will come forth through judgment and hope. And we'll link arms with them at Mount Zion, and all of the nations of the world will get their attention and will be coming up the mountain as well to participate and experience the healing for the nations and the blessings that God had originally promised to be for them as a result of the covenant promise that he originally made to Abraham. So kind of some big ideas. All right, well, thanks for your patience. We'll have fun this week. Wrapping up our Friday will be the theological journal for these 4 books, all in one document, of course, and submitted to the Turn It In portal. And then you've got to turn in your thesis statement here before we leave for spring break. All right, have fun, and email me if you need any assistance or any special help this week. I'll be available. Thanks.